What drains and restores one's spirit? There have been times in my life when I felt drained of energy, lacking that familiar sense of get up and go. At such moments, even small stresses can knock us off balance. Responsibilities weigh heavily. Obligations feel relentless. You may recognise something of this in yourself. Perhaps a period of discouragement or loneliness, or a quiet sense of being cut off, even while life looks full and busy from the outside. So what lies behind these lasting moods? Where do they come from? And just as importantly, what restores our inner life? What can make things better? When we struggle to make sense of our lives and yearn for something better, what rekindles our appetite for living or our hopes for the future? Across the world's spiritual traditions, there is a striking similar answer to what causes these states of depletion. It centres on the idea that we limit ourselves to a particular way of being conscious, what is often called ego consciousness. When this dominates our lives, we tend to live from habit and react to events automatically rather than responding with presence and awareness. Life becomes something we manage, defend and control rather than something we inhabit fully. Now, the ego itself is not the villain of the piece. A sense of self is essential. Without ego, we could not develop skills, enjoy pleasure, build self-esteem, or test reality. We need a stable sense of me in order to grow up, take responsibility, and function in the physical world as separate individuals. There is nothing wrong with ego consciousness as such. The difficulty arises when it becomes all we know, when it dominates our way of living. Modern life does much to encourage this imbalance. We are constantly nudged to experience ourselves as separate from nature, separate from our communities, and often from our own bodies. Success, security, and even happiness are presented as personal achievements, things we must secure for ourselves. Now, the danger is that we begin to organise our entire experience around me versus not me. From there flow many familiar anxieties, envy of what others have, fear of losing what we possess, shame about how we may be judged, feeling lonely even in the midst of company. Deep down, many people sense that something essential is missing, though it is hard to name. It feels like a separation, not just from others, but from something deeper in ourselves. And these emotions are experienced as the absence of qualities that nourish us: peace, acceptance, generosity of spirit, delight in the well-being of others. But when ego consciousness dominates, life easily comes to feel like an endless series of problems to be solved. If I can just get through this exam, I'll relax. If I can just fix this issue, things will settle down. But life does not work that way. Problems keep coming, and some are insoluble. And the ego, determined to stay in control, never quite rests. One common term for having a constant state of ego consciousness is that of spiritual sleep. We remain inwardly asleep when we live only at the surface of ourselves, driven by appetite, habit and reflex. We absorb a set of expectations early in life and rarely question them. We get educated, get ahead, get more, get more. Our inner narrative becomes stuck and repetitive, and we turn over the same worries and do this without being spiritually awake to fresh insight, forgetting deeper values. What makes this especially powerful is that it feels normal. We assume this anxious, self-orientated way of living is simply how things are. It becomes invisible to us. Now, different spiritual traditions give different names to this condition. As well as spiritual sleep, they speak of ignorance, of illusion, of attachment, of mindless reactivity, of spiritual poverty or sin. But the common thread is clear. When ego consciousness is paramount, we see everything only from our own narrow standpoint, without realizing there is another way of seeing. So, what restores us? Well, according to these spiritual traditions, it is the transcending of ego consciousness that restores us. Now, their language varies, as I've suggested, but the underlying insight is remarkably consistent. Now, indigenous people speak of the self as part of a living whole. In Sufism, the ego dissolves in divine love. Taoism describes a return to natural harmony. Hindu traditions speak of realizing non-duality. Buddhism sees the ego not as something to be destroyed, but as a cognitive illusion. Christian mysticism speaks of surrender, of the self yielding to divine love and purpose. Now, what all these paths suggest is that renewed energy for living comes not from greater self-orientation, but from connection with a deeper spiritual source and with other people. And from this comes a renewed energy for living, a sense of being awake to life rather than merely coping with life. Now, often the call to transformation is prompted by difficulty, perhaps illness, loss or suffering that overwhelm our usual strategies. But a severe crisis is not always required. The spiritual traditions also encourage a reflective understanding of why personal transformation matters. Without any knowledge of what they teach, we would have no understanding of how to begin to try to change, and so they offer practical guidance, reflection, ethical living, meditation and prayer. These practices are not about self-improvement in the usual sense. Rather, they help to quieten the ego, allowing something deeper to flow into awareness. Now, the 18th century spiritual writer Emanuel Swedenborg described this deeper flow into awareness as an inspiration of a heavenly state into our soul, a dimension of joy and understanding that arises from one's inmost being and is immeasurably richer than ordinary pleasures. Those who have tasted it find it hard to describe, speaking instead of harmony, of clarity, and perhaps a sense of profound rightness. And even for those who do not use such language, there is a sense that something quietly sustaining already exists within us. Swedenborg himself also believed that remnants of spiritual qualities, heavenly inflow of innocence, of kindness and of truth, often formed in childhood, that they remain within us, waiting to be reawakened. The poet John O'Donoghue put it this way: "There is a quiet light that shines in every heart. Though it is always secretly there, it draws no attention to itself. It is what illuminates our minds to see beauty, our desire to seek possibility, and our hearts to love life." Now, in this speech, I've talked about ego consciousness. This is a reactive way of living arising from a self-orientated awareness of life. I've talked about how there is an imbalance in modern life when we allow this state of mind to dominate. We have become vulnerable to a range of negative emotions. For example, this condition has been called spiritual sleep. The transcendence of ego consciousness is a common feature of the teachings of different spiritual traditions, and one idea is that the inflow of heavenly life is a feature of childhood which unconsciously remains available to us, waiting and waiting to be reawakened. Thanks for listening to me. And if you've been interested, why not give me a like and offer a comment? It encourages YouTube to show this video to a wider audience. And if you're interested in more about universal aspects of spirituality, you can click the playlist link